The silence in the Copper Creek Bank was the first thing that felt wrong. It wasn't the quiet of commerce. It was the suffocating stillness of a held breath. Alberta Knoxley, kneeling on the polished floorboards, felt it settle over her like a shroud. The air, usually thick with the scent of old paper and brass polish, was now thin and sharp with fear. Beside her, Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, lay in a heap of wilted calico, her fainting spell a small mercy in the face of the unfolding terror. Alberta pressed a cool cloth to the woman's forehead, her movement steady, and practiced a small island of calm in a sea of dread. 4 men had entered the bank. 3 were coarse and twitchy, their eyes darting around the room like cornered animals. But the 4th, the leader, was different. He moved with an unhurried grace that was more terrifying than any frantic shouting. He wore a long black duster that fell to his ankles, and his face was shadowed by the brim of a clean black hat. When he spoke, his voice was not the gravelly bark of a common outlaw, but a low-cultured murmur that slid under the skin and turned the blood to ice. He hadn't raised it once yet. Every person in the bank, from the trembling teller to the burly rancher caught by surprise, obeyed his every command without hesitation. Alberta risked a glance over her shoulder. The leader stood by the counter, one gloved hand resting lightly on the polished wood, as the teller frantically stuffed sacks with money. His eyes, visible in the sliver of shadow beneath his hat, were chillingly calm, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. They swept the room with an unnerving detachment, assessing, controlling. He was not just robbing a bank. He was conducting a symphony of fear. The symphony was nearing its crescendo. The sacks were full. The leader gave a curt nod, and his men began backing toward the door. It was then that the first shot rang out. Not from inside, but from the street, a single defiant crack of a rifle. A stray bullet, fired by some brave or foolish soul, shattered the bank's front window. Shards of glass rained onto the boardwalk. The leader flinched, not in fear, but in annoyance. The bullet had torn through the sleeve of his duster, clipping his arm. He grunted a flicker of pain, finally breaking through his serene composure. As he stumbled back a step, his hand went to his chest, and something small and silver slipped from his grasp, falling silently onto the dusty floorboards unseen. His men laid down covering fire, their pistols roaring in the enclosed space, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and panic. In the ensuing chaos, they dragged their wounded leader out into the street, disappearing into a storm of dust and panicked shouts. Silence, thick and ringing, descended once more. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Gable stirred, moaning softly. The spell was broken. People began to sob, to whisper, to scramble to their feet. Alberta stayed on her knees, her focus narrowing on the small, gleaming object near the teller's cage. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still catching the light. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, and she crawled toward it, her skirts whispering against the floor. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. It felt strangely familiar in her palm. With the town's clamor rising outside, she pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open, her breath hitched. The world dissolved into a roaring in her ears. Inside, protected by a tiny pane of scratched glass, was a faded tintype portrait. A young woman with her own serious eyes stood with her arm around a gangly, smiling boy. It was her Alberta at 22. And beside her, with a gap-toothed grin and a shock of unruly hair, was her younger brother Tommy. It was impossible. Her blood ran cold, a glacial tide of disbelief and horror. This wasn't just any locket. It was the one she had placed in Tommy's hands as he lay in his coffin, her last gift, a promise that he would never be alone. The locket she had buried with him 6 years ago in a lonely Kansas cemetery 1,000 miles away. The man with the winter sky eyes, the cold, precise leader of a gang of thieves, was either a grave robber of the most ghoulish sort or something far, far worse. The past she had fled, the trauma she had buried deeper than any coffin, had just been violently, impossibly exhumed on the floor of the Copper Creek Bank. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the still afternoon air, a bitter perfume clinging to the dust motes, dancing in the slanted rays of the setting sun. The chaos had subsided, replaced by a low humming dread that had settled over the town of Copper Creek. Men stood in tight, grim-faced knots on the boardwalk, their voices low and angry. Women gathered on porches, whispering behind their hands. The shattered window of the bank gaped like a fresh wound in the town's heart. Alberta Knoxley moved through it all like a ghost. The silver locket was a cold, heavy weight in her apron pocket, pressing against her hip with every step. Her mind replayed the image within it, Tommy's smile frozen in time. The locket had been a gift from their mother, and after her death, Alberta had given it to him. He treasured it, and she had buried it with him, a desperate act of love and finality. How could it be here? The blood-red sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks that framed the valley, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The worn wooden planks of the boardwalk groaned under her boots as she made her way toward the sheriff's office. At 28, she had built a life here, a quiet existence defined by her work. She was the prairie nurse, the woman who delivered babies in midnight storms, and sat with the dying offering a measure of peace with her steady hands and calm voice. She had sought refuge in the practicalities of healing a penance for the one life she had failed to save, now that failure had come roaring back. The sheriff's office was a small, cluttered space that smelled of stale coffee and cheap cigars. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary disappointment, looked up from his desk as she entered. His suspenders strained against a belly that spoke of too many years behind that desk and not enough on the trail. "Miss Knoxley," he sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Don't tell me Mrs. Gable had a relapse." "She's resting," Alberta said, her voice unnaturally flat. She walked to his desk and placed the locket on a stack of wanted posters. Its silver gleam seemed obscene against the grainy images of hardened criminals. "I found this in the bank after they fled." Miller picked it up, his thick fingers fumbling with the clasp. He opened it, squinted at the portrait, then looked at her, his expression blank. "A family heirloom, looks like. The leader must have dropped it when he was hit." "It's mine," she stated the words, tasting like ash. "Or it was. That locket was buried with my brother 6 years ago. In Kansas." The sheriff's weary expression sharpened into one of disbelief. He looked from the locket back to her face. "Now hold on, Alberta. That's a mighty strange claim. Lockets look alike, do they?" She met his gaze, her own calm, a brittle shield over the turmoil within. "That scratch on the glass, my brother made it with a pin the day I gave it to him. He said he was marking his treasure. Sheriff, the man who dropped this is either a grave robber or his killer. I will have an answer." Her voice, though quiet, held the unyielding temper of forged steel. She had built her life on a foundation of control, but this had fractured it to its core. Miller leaned back, the chair creaking in protest. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, a long-standing habit when faced with a problem that couldn't be solved with a jail cell or a stern warning. "I understand you're upset, but we've got nothing to go on." 4 men masks, they rode east. Could be halfway to the territories by now. "We're tracking them, but the trail is cold." There were witnesses, she pressed. Crawford Nixley was standing outside the assayer's office. He saw them ride in, saw them ride out. He saw the leader's face when his mask slipped. "Nixley." The sheriff grunted. Good luck getting more than a dozen words out of him. That man's been locked up inside himself since his wife passed. He slid the locket back across the desk. "Go home, Alberta. Let me handle this. Stirring up old ghosts won't do anyone any good." But the ghost was already stirred. It was walking beside her, whispering Tommy's name in her ear. She picked up the locket, its cold weight a terrible comfort. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff." She left his office and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, and the setting sun casting her long shadow behind her. She had a choice. She could heed the sheriff's advice, go back to her small cabin, and try to bury the past a second time. Or she could ride north to the Broken Arrow Ranch and confront the man who carried his own ghosts. There was no real choice at all. The ride to the Broken Arrow was 15 miles of fading light and rising wind. The ranch sprawled across a vast basin, a testament to years of hard work. But as Alberta approached the main house, she felt a profound sense of emptiness emanating from it. The silence in the sprawling yard was a monument to loss. She found Crawford Nixley by the corral, mending a leather strap with deft, powerful movements. He moved with the heavy stillness of a man carrying a ghost on his shoulders. At 35, the prairie sun and bitter winters had weathered his face, carving lines of hardship around his eyes and mouth. But it was the grief that had hollowed him out, leaving a stark, unapproachable emptiness in its place. He looked up as she dismounted, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Miss Noxley," he said, his voice the low rasp of a man who didn't waste words. "This is a bad time." "I'm sure it is, Mr. Nixley," she replied, stepping toward him. "I was told you were a witness to the robbery today." He didn't stop his work, his hands moving with practiced economy. "I saw what I saw. 4 men, one in black. His mask slipped when he was shot," she pressed. "Did you see his face?" Crawford finally stilled, setting down his tools with deliberate slowness. He turned to face her fully, and in the twilight, she saw the full depth of the sorrow in his eyes. It was a mirror of the ache in her own chest, a familiar and terrible kinship. "I saw a man's face. That's all. This is my business. Stay out of it." It became my business when he dropped this. She held out the locket, its silver face catching the last rays of the dying sun. He glanced at it, his expression unchanging, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "A trinket." "My trinket," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "It was buried with my brother. The man who leads that gang dug up my brother's grave." For the first time, a flicker of something other than grief crossed Crawford's face. It wasn't sympathy, but a sharp, assessing curiosity. He looked from the locket to her, his gaze intense. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you saw his face," she insisted. "And because I will not let this go. I don't care what the sheriff says. That man has a name, and I will know it." The wind picked up, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. It carried the scent of dust and distant rain, the lonely smell of the high prairie. Crawford Nixley stood before her, a fortress of a man, walled off by pain. But she had seen that flicker in his eyes. In their shared landscape of loss, she had perhaps just found a gate. Alberta clutched the locket in her hand, the engraved edges digging into her palm. It was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned to smoke and mirrors. She had ridden away from the Broken Arrow, with Crawford's curt dismissal echoing in her ears, but she was not defeated. She was a healer. She knew that some wounds festered if left unattended, and the one torn open by the locket was already poisoning her. The next morning, she returned to town, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories and chilling possibilities. Who would desecrate a grave for a silver locket? The act was one of such specific cruelty, it suggested something more than random theft. It felt personal. She decided to start with what she knew: medicine. A man had been shot. Even a flesh wound, if not properly tended, could lead to infection. The outlaws would need supplies, bandages, carbolic acid laudanum for the pain. She began a quiet tour of the surrounding area, visiting the small, isolated homesteads she served. Under the guise of checking on a new mother or a child with a cough, she asked careful questions. Had they seen a group of 4 riders? Had anyone come asking for medical supplies? Her inquiries yielded nothing but worried glances and whispered rumors about the robbery. The frontier was a place of guarded privacy. Strangers were objects of suspicion, and questions were often met with closed doors. Days bled into a week. The locket became a constant weight in her pocket, a cold reminder of her failure. The calm, controlled woman who had arrived in Copper Creek was fraying at the edges. Sleep offered no respite, only nightmares of open graves. And Tommy's smiling face fading into the cold eyes of the outlaw leader. It was during a visit to the Morrison place to check on Hattie and her newborn son that she found her first thread. Jed Morrison, a man whose hands were as calloused as his opinions, was complaining about a string of bad luck. "First, that damned bank robbery spooks the whole town," he grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near a fence post. "Then my prize bull turns up dead by the creek. Poisoned," Doc Miller says. "Now I hear the Tarlows lost half their winter hay to a fire that started out of nowhere. It's like a curse has fallen on this valley." Alberta's attention sharpened. The Tarlows had a fire. 2 nights ago, Hattie confirmed from the porch, bouncing the baby on her hip. Margaret Tarlow was in town yesterday, buying supplies. Said they were lucky the whole barn didn't go up. They're thinking of selling out. Jennison's heart ain't what it used to be, and this string of troubles has worn him down. A cold suspicion began to form in Alberta's mind. A poisoned bull. A suspicious fire. These were not random acts of misfortune. They felt targeted, designed to create despair. Her investigation took a new direction. She spent the next few days talking to people not about outlaws, but about land. At the general store, she overheard 2 ranchers discussing the low price of cattle and the difficulty of making ends meet. One of them mentioned that a new company, the Western Development Consortium, had been making offers on land, buying up parcels from families who were struggling. The offers were low, but for a man on the verge of ruin, they were a lifeline. Her path inevitably led her back to the Broken Arrow. Crawford Nixley's ranch was the largest and most prosperous in the region, a keystone property. If someone were trying to consolidate the land in the valley, the Broken Arrow would be the crown jewel. She found him shoeing a horse in the blacksmith's shed, the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal echoing in the still air. He worked with a fierce concentration sweat beading on his brow. A small, dark-haired boy sat on a nearby crate, watching his father with a solemn intensity. This must be Tremont, the son he had spoken of, the little ghost who followed him around the ranch. Crawford didn't stop his work as she approached. "Come to tell me more ghost stories, Miss Knoxley. I've come to talk about something real," she said, her voice steady. Jed Morrison's bull was poisoned. The Tarlos's hay barn was set on fire. Both were considering selling their land. "I believe someone is trying to drive the ranchers out of this valley." He finally paused, resting the horse's hoof on his leather-aproned lap. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That's a big accusation." "Is it?" she countered. "Have you had any trouble here? Any strange accidents?" His jaw tightened. "A section of my north fence was cut last week. Lost 24 head before we found the break. Wrote it off as vandals. And has anyone offered to buy your land?" He slammed the hammer down on the anvil, the sharp clang making her jump. The boy Tremont flinched, but didn't make a sound. "A man from the Western Development Consortium came by a month ago. Offered me half of what this place is worth. I sent him packing." They stared at each other in the dusty, firelit shed. The suspicion that had been a whisper in Alberta's mind was now a roar. This was not about a single bank robbery or a stolen locket. It was a conspiracy. The robberies, the accidents, she said, thinking aloud. They're creating financial hardship and fear. It makes the company's low offers seem reasonable. They're bleeding the valley dry, one ranch at a time. Crawford picked up a rasp and began filing the horse's hoof, his movements rough and angry. "It's just business. Ugly but not illegal. The bank robbery wasn't just business," she shot back. "And neither was this." She pulled the locket from her pocket, its presence a cold rebuke to his cynicism. He glanced at it and then at the small boy sitting on the crate. Tremont's large, dark eyes were fixed on Alberta, filled with a child's unfiltered curiosity. For the first time, Crawford's hard facade seemed to crack. A look of profound weariness passed over his face. "My son, Tremont," he said, his voice softer. He gestured with his head toward the boy. "Tree, this is Miss Knoxley." The boy said nothing, just continued to stare. Alberta knelt down, bringing herself to his level. She offered him a small, gentle smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tremont." He looked from her to the locket still in her hand. He pointed a small, grubby finger at it. "Pretty. It was a gift from my mother," she said quietly, opening it to show him the portrait. "This is me. And this was my brother Tommy." Tremont slid off the crate and took a hesitant step closer, his eyes wide as he studied the image. He reached out and gently touched the glass over Tommy's face. The simple, innocent gesture sent a pang of grief through Alberta so sharp it took her breath away. "He looks happy," Tremont whispered the first words he had spoken. "He was," she said, her voice thick. "What are you doing?" Crawford's voice was harsh, cutting through the fragile moment. "Leave the boy out of this." "I'm not bringing him into anything," Alberta replied, standing to face him. "But this isn't just about my past anymore, Mr. Nixley. It's about his future. If this company takes over the valley, what kind of life will he have? This is his home, his legacy. Isn't that worth fighting for?" Crawford looked from Alberta's impassioned face to his son, who was still gazing at the locket. The argument had struck home, hitting the one part of him that wasn't shielded by grief, his love for his child. He threw the rasp onto the workbench with a clatter. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "You want to fight? Let's fight. The head of that company is staying at the hotel in town. A fancy man from back east. Calls himself Silas Kane." The name meant nothing to her, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. Silas Kane, a respectable businessman. The kind of man who could orchestrate ruin with a smile and a handshake. "He's hosting a reception tomorrow night." Crawford continued, his eyes darkening. "For the town council, trying to convince them to support his vision for the valley's future. If you want to see the face of the man who's trying to destroy everything we have, he'll be there." A plan began to form in Alberta's mind, audacious and dangerous. "Then we'll be there too." Crawford stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "We, you and I, a prairie nurse and a reclusive rancher, they won't even let us in the door. Then we'll find a way in," she said, her determination hardening into resolve. It's time Mr. Kane met the people whose lives he's so casually dismantling. In the quiet of the shed, a reluctant alliance was forged. A grieving man fighting for his son's future, and a woman fighting to reclaim a stolen past. And between them, a small, silent boy who had just found a flicker of connection in the sad eyes of a long-dead stranger. The Copper Creek Grand Hotel was a monument to misplaced ambition. Built during a short-lived silver boom, its 3 stories of brick and gilded trim towered over the dusty, one-story clapboard buildings that made up the rest of the town. Tonight, its windows blazed with light, spilling a warm yellow glow onto the street, where carriages deposited the town's most influential citizens. From across the street, cloaked in the shadows of the livery stable, Alberta and Crawford watched them arrive. Sheriff Miller looking uncomfortable in a stiffly starched collar. Mayor Thompson, his chest puffed out with self-importance. The town's merchants and their wives dressed in their Sunday best. "This is a fool's errand," Crawford muttered for the 10th time. He was wearing a dark suit that looked like it hadn't been touched since his wife's funeral. It fit him poorly tight across his broad shoulders, a cage for a man used to open spaces. "The biggest fools are the ones who do nothing," Alberta countered. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico, but Bridie Varnell, her meddlesome but well-meaning friend, had insisted on loaning her a dark wool shawl embroidered with silk flowers. It felt like a costume, a flimsy disguise for the prairie nurse who was about to confront a wolf in his den. Their plan was simple and likely to fail. They would wait for the reception to be in full swing and then attempt to walk through the front door as if they belonged there. Alberta's reputation as a nurse might grant her a moment's hesitation from the guards, and in that moment she hoped to find Silas Kane. As they watched, a sleek, black carriage pulled up drawn by two perfectly matched black horses. A man stepped out, and even from a distance, he commanded attention. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to wealth and power. Silas Kane. He paused on the hotel steps to greet the mayor, his smile charming and his handshake firm. There was nothing about him that suggested a connection to the brutal outlaws who had robbed the bank. He was the picture of civility. "That's him," Crawford said, his voice tight. An hour later, they made their move. They walked across the street, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Two burly men in ill-fitting suits guarded the hotel entrance, their arms crossed over their chests. "Private reception?" one of them grunted as they approached. "Of course," Alberta said, her voice calm and pleasant. "Mr. Kane is expecting me." "I'm Alberta Knoxley. I have some information for him regarding his recent land acquisitions." She held his gaze, projecting an authority she did not feel. The guard hesitated, his brow furrowed. The name was unfamiliar, but her confidence gave him pause. Before he could respond, the hotel doors swung open, and Silas Kane himself appeared in the entryway, a glass of champagne in his hand. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" His voice was smooth-cultured, the same voice Alberta remembered from the bank. The sound of it made the hair on her arms stand on end. He let his gaze drift over them, his eyes lingering on Alberta. They were a pale, intelligent gray, and they held a flicker of amusement. "Miss Alberta Knoxley." He said the name rolling off his tongue as if he had been expecting her. "The celebrated prairie nurse. I've heard so much about your good works." He turned his smile on Crawford, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "And you must be Mr. Nixley of the Broken Arrow." "A pleasure. Please come in. We have much to discuss." He stepped aside, holding the door open. The guards, looking confused, moved out of their way. Exchanging a wary glance, Alberta and Crawford stepped into the lion's den. The ballroom was a swirl of music, conversation, and glittering light. A string quartet played in the corner, their music a thin veneer of elegance over the raw frontier town outside. Kane led them to a quiet alcove, away from the main crowd. He procured glasses of champagne from a passing waiter, handing them one each. "To the future of Copper Creek." Kane toasted, his smile never faltering. Neither of them drank. Mr. Kane. Alberta began deciding directness was her only weapon. Several ranchers in this valley have recently suffered a series of misfortunes. Fires poisoned livestock. All of them have received offers to sell their land to your company. Kane took a slow sip of his champagne, his eyes twinkling over the rim of the glass. "A tragic series of coincidences, I'm sure. The frontier is a harsh place, is it not? My company merely seeks to provide a safety net for those who find themselves unable to cope with its rigors." "You call preying on their desperations a safety net?" Crawford's voice was a low growl. Kane's smile tightened. "I call it progress, Mr. Nixley. This valley is rich in resources far more valuable than a few herds of cattle. I envision a future of mining, of industry, a railroad spur. A future that will bring prosperity to everyone." "Prosperity for you, you mean," Alberta said. "For all of us," Kane corrected smoothly. He set his glass down and turned his full attention to her. His polite mask seemed to slip for a fraction of a second, and she saw something cold and venomous in his eyes. "Miss Knoxley, a woman of your talents is wasted in such a primitive place." "But then primitives are so easy to control, are they not?" The veiled threat was unmistakable. Before she could respond, he reached into his waistcoat pocket. "I believe this belongs to you." He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was the silver locket. Alberta stared at it, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was a confession, a taunt, a declaration of war, all delivered with a polite smile. She had walked in here hoping to uncover a conspiracy, and the man at its center had just laid his cards on the table. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let's just say I have an appreciation for antiquities," Kane said softly, "especially those with sentimental value." He closed his fingers around it. "Now about your ranch, Mr. Nixley. I am prepared to make you a new offer, a very generous one. I would advise you to accept it. It would be a shame if your lovely son were to suffer any misfortune." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as clear and sharp as a knife's edge. Crawford took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Alberta put a hand on his arm, holding him back. Violence here would solve nothing. Kane's smile returned triumphant. "Think it over. I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. Enjoy the party." He turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving them standing in the alcove, the phantom weight of his threats hanging in the air between them. The midpoint had been reached. The enemy had a name and a face, and he had just made it clear that this was no longer a battle for land. It was a battle for their lives. The stolen locket was not just a clue, it was a leash, and Silas Kane was holding the other end. They left the hotel in a state of stunned silence, and the festive music fading behind them like a dream turning into a nightmare. Kane's open threat against Tremont had changed everything. The game of cat and mouse was over. This was now a siege. He had the locket. Alberta said, her voice hollow, as they stood by their horses in the darkness. He admitted it. He's the one. He's the one who hired them. Crawford corrected his face, a grim mask. Kane is too clean to do the dirty work himself. But he's the snake in the garden, no doubt about it. He slammed a fist against his saddle, the leather groaning in protest. "To threaten my son. He's trying to scare us, Crawford," she said, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were coiled tight with rage. "He wants you to sell. If you sell, he wins. And if I don't, my boy pays the price." He shook his head, a look of desperation in his eyes. "I can't risk that, Alberta. I can't." "We won't," she said, her voice fierce. "We won't let him. We'll protect Tremont. We'll watch him every second. But we will not give in to this man." Over the next 2 weeks, the Broken Arrow became a fortress. Crawford pulled his most trusted ranch hands, Orville Trent, and a grizzled ex-soldier named Patch, into his confidence. They began riding the perimeter of the ranch in shifts, armed and alert. Tremont was never out of an adult's sight. He was too young to understand the specifics of the danger, but he could feel the tension that had descended upon his home. The quiet, solemn boy became even more withdrawn, clinging to Alberta whenever she was near. Her presence on the ranch became a constant. She tended to her patients in town during the day, but her evenings were spent at the Broken Arrow, her medical bag a permanent fixture by the door. She and Crawford worked together with a grim, unspoken understanding. The fragile connection that had begun to form between them was now forged in the fire of a shared threat. They moved around each other in the small ranch house, their conversations clipped and practical, but fraught with an undercurrent of fear and a growing desperate reliance on one another. One evening, as she was helping Tremont with his reading by the fire, the boy looked up at her, his dark eyes serious. "Are the bad men coming here, Miss Alberta?" Her heart clenched. "Your papa and I won't let anyone hurt you, sweetheart. You're safe here." "He says you're his safe lady," Tremont whispered, glancing toward his father, who was cleaning a rifle at the kitchen table. "Now you're my safe lady, too." Later that night, after Tremont was asleep, Alberta found Crawford on the front porch, staring out into the impenetrable darkness. The wind was picking up, carrying the dry, dusty scent of a storm. "He's scared," Crawford said without turning. "We're all scared," she answered, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He's a smart boy. He knows something is wrong." Crawford finally turned to face her, his expression raw in the faint moonlight. "I can't lose him, Alberta. He's all I have left. You won't." "How can you be so sure Kane is powerful? He has money influence." "What do we have?" "A few ranch hands and a stubborn refusal to break." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "Maybe I should just sell. Take Tree and go somewhere else. Start over and let him win," she asked softly. "Let him desecrate my brother's memory and destroy your home. No. We fight. That's what people like us do. We don't run." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "You've got a hold on me, Alberta. I'll be damned if I know what to do about it." He stepped closer, closing the space between them, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "When this is over, if we get through this—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The promise hung between them, fragile and powerful. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of their first kiss, but with a deep, aching tenderness that spoke of fear and hope, and the terrifying possibility of a future. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke the following afternoon. It was not a rainstorm, but a dust storm, a malevolent, swirling monster that rose up from the plains. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the sun vanished behind a thick curtain of dirt. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roof and rattling the windows in their frames. Visibility dropped to near zero. Crawford and his men had spent the morning securing the livestock in the barn. They were all inside the main house, now the doors and windows barred, towels stuffed under the sills to keep out the choking dust. The air inside grew thick and heavy, each breath a gritty struggle. It was in the heart of this claustrophobic chaos that they came. The sound of splintering wood from the back door was almost lost in the roar of the wind. Crawford and Patch spun around, rifles raised. 3 men burst into the kitchen, their faces covered with bandanas, their eyes wide and feral. Behind them, silhouetted in the doorway, against the swirling brown maelstrom, stood Silas Kane. He was no longer the charming businessman. His fine suit was covered in dust, and the polite mask was gone, revealing the cold, predatory face beneath. In his hand, he held a pistol aimed directly at Tremont, who stood frozen by the fireplace. "This ends today," Nixley Kane said, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "The ranch is mine." The world inside the ranch house shrank to the space of a held breath. The howling wind outside was a distant roar, secondary to the thunder of blood in Alberta's ears. Silas Kane stood in the doorway, a specter conjured from the dust, his pistol an extension of his will. His gaze was fixed on Crawford, but the barrel was pointed at the small, terrified figure of Tremont. "Let the boy go," Kane Crawford said, his voice dangerously low. He hadn't moved, his rifle held steady, but every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring. Kane let out a short, humorless laugh. "You are in no position to make demands. Your men will drop their weapons, now, or the boy's future becomes a very short story." Patch, the grizzled ranch hand, glanced at Crawford, awaiting the order. Orville Trent, a man whose laziness was legendary, looked surprisingly resolute, his shotgun held with a steady grip. "Do it," Crawford bit out, his voice choked with fury and despair. Reluctantly, Patch and Orville lowered their guns. Kane's men moved quickly, kicking the weapons away and shoving the 2 ranch hands against the wall. Kane stepped fully into the room, the dust swirling around him. He gestured with his pistol toward Tremont. "Come here, boy." Tremont didn't move, his small body rigid with fear. His eyes darted to Alberta, a silent, desperate plea. "It's all right, sweetheart," Alberta said, her voice a strange oasis of calm in the maelstrom. She took a slow step forward, placing herself between Kane and the boy. "He's just a child. He's no threat to you." Kane's eyes, those chips of wintry ice, shifted to her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Ah, Miss Knoxley, always the protector. It's a commendable trait, and a fatal one." He kept the pistol aimed in Tremont's direction, but his words were all for her. "Did you ever wonder how I found you? All the way out here in this godforsaken dust bowl. Did you think you could just disappear after what you did?" "What I did," Alberta's mind raced. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" His smile widened. "You destroyed a good man, Miss Knoxley, a respected physician. You and your hysterical accusations. You ruined him. You took everything from him." A dawning, sickening horror began to creep up Alberta's spine. The cultured voice, the cold precision, the calculated cruelty. It was all starting to connect in some terrible, unthinkable way. "My father was Dr. Robert Hartwell Kane," said his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Does that name ring a bell? The name hit her like a physical blow. Doc Hartwell, the arrogant, prideful doctor from Kansas whose refusal to listen had cost Tommy his life. Hartwell. She breathed. "That's right," he hissed. "You slandered him, accused him of malpractice, of incompetence. You turned the whole town against him." His practice crumbled. His reputation was shattered. He died a few years later, a broke, disgraced alcoholic, drinking himself into the grave because of your lies. They weren't lies. Alberta cried, the memory of Tommy's pale face rising before her. "He was arrogant and drunk. He let my brother die. He made a mistake," Kane roared, his composure finally cracking. "A mistake you never let him forget. I swore on his grave that I would find you. That I would take away everything you ever cared about, just like you took everything from me. I would ruin your new life, piece by piece." He gestured around the room. "This ranch, this man, this child. This is my revenge, Miss Knoxley. My father's legacy." Crawford stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. All of this. The robberies, the threats. It was all for her. She was the reason Kane affirmed his gaze locking with Alberta's. "You were just a pawn, Nixley. A means to an end." He laughed again, a harsh grating sound. "And I had the most perfect accomplice. Someone who knew your every weakness. Someone who despised you almost as much as I despise her." As he spoke, one of his men knocked over a kerosene lamp in the scuffle. It shattered on the floorboards, and a line of fire erupted greedily, licking its way up the dry wooden wall. The air filled with smoke, thick and choking. The dust storm outside the fire inside the house was becoming a tomb. "Who?" Crawford demanded, his eyes darting from the flames to Kane. Kane's smile was predatory. "Your beloved wife, of course. Alma." The word struck Crawford with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face draining of all color. "No. You're lying." Am I? Kane reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, tossing it onto the floor at Crawford's feet. Her diary. We corresponded for years. She was a bitter, jealous woman, Nixley. She hated how much you loved this land more than you ever loved her, she said. She fed me everything I needed to know. The ranch's finances, the neighbors' weaknesses, your stubborn pride. She helped me plan your ruin from beyond the grave. Crawford stared at the diary as if it were a coiled snake. The idealized memory of his wife, the saint he had been grieving for 3 years, shattered into a million pieces. The fire was spreading fast, smoke filling the room. Through the haze, Alberta saw her chance. Kane was distracted, gloating in his moment of triumph, his attention fixed on Crawford's broken expression. Her medical bag lay on a nearby table. Her choice was clear. She was a healer, not a killer. Revenge was a poison, just as Kane's obsession proved. Her purpose was to save lives, not take them. Crawford, she said, her voice sharp, cutting through his shock. Get Tremont. The command jolted him out of his horrified trance. He lunged for his son, scooping him into his arms and backing toward the front of the house, away from the flames. As Kane turned his attention back to her, Alberta moved. She didn't grab a weapon. She grabbed a small glass bottle from her bag chloroform. Uncorking it with one hand, she snatched a clean rag from the table with the other. It's over, Miss Knoxley, Kane sneered, raising his pistol. At that moment, Orville Trant, a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding exertion, chose to act. With a surprisingly powerful shove, he threw himself into the back of the outlaw nearest him, sending the man stumbling forward into Kane. The pistol fired the bullet, going wild, embedding itself in the ceiling. In that split second of confusion, Alberta lunged. She clamped the chloroform-soaked rag over Kane's mouth and nose, pressing with all her strength. He struggled, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He tried to bring the pistol around, but she held on, her knuckles white. His movements became sluggish, his eyes rolled back in his head. After a few desperate seconds, he went limp, slumping to the floor in an unconscious heap. The remaining two outlaws, seeing their leader fall, and the room filling with fire and smoke, lost their nerve. Patch, recovering his footing, landed a solid punch that sent one of them sprawling. The other turned and fled out the back door, disappearing into the storm. The fire, Patch yelled. We've got to get out. Crawford, holding Tremont tight, was already at the front door, pulling it open against the force of the wind. Dust and smoke swirled together in a suffocating vortex. Alberta grabbed her medical bag and followed Patch and Orville right behind her, dragging the remaining outlaw with them. They stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air, and watched in horror as the flames, fanned by the ferocious wind, engulfed their home. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind, which had raged like a demon all night, gentled to a whisper, and the thick, brown curtain of dust began to settle. A weak, watery sun rose over the horizon, its pale light illuminating a scene of devastation. The Broken Arrow ranch house was a smoldering ruin, a blackened skeleton against the bruised morning sky. They had spent the night in the relative safety of the main barn, huddled together against the cold and the lingering shock. Alberta had tended to the wounded, a shallow gash on Patch's arm, bruises on Orville, and the outlaw they had captured, who was now securely tied up. She worked with a quiet efficiency, her healer's instincts a steady anchor in the chaotic aftermath. Crawford sat apart from the others, Tremont asleep in his lap, the boy's small face streaked with soot and tears. He stared at the smoking remains of his home, his expression hollow. It wasn't just the house he had lost. It was the past. Kane's cruel revelations about Alma had burned away his grief, leaving behind the bitter ash of betrayal. He held Alma's diary in his hand unopened. As the sun climbed higher, a posse led by Sheriff Miller rode into the ranch yard. They had found Kane's other man, wandering on the prairie, disoriented and half-choked by the dust. The story came tumbling out. The sheriff and his men took the captured outlaws, along with the still unconscious Silas Kane, or Hartwell, into custody. Heard the commotion, Miller said, looking from the burned-out house to the exhausted faces of its survivors. He glanced at Alberta, a new respect in his eyes. You said you'd get your answer. Looks like you did. After the posse left, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Orville and Patch began the grim work of assessing the damage. Alberta approached Crawford, who hadn't moved. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Are you all right? She asked softly. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the diary in his hand. She hated me, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. All those years I was grieving a woman who hated me. You were grieving the woman you thought she was, Alberta corrected gently. You were grieving the love you gave her. That love was real, Crawford. Her bitterness doesn't change that. He finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a deep, soul-crushing weariness. How do you do it? How do you just let go of the ghosts? You don't, she said, thinking of Tommy. You just learn to live with them. You make room for new things, better things, until the ghosts don't take up so much space. He looked down at Tremont, his expression softening. He pulled the boy's sleeping form tighter against his chest. He's all that matters now. He looked back at the smoldering house, then with a final decisive movement, he tossed the diary into the still glowing embers. They watched as the leather cover curled, blackened, and was consumed by the last of the flames. A past both idealized and poisoned turned to ash. The sun was fully up now, its light gaining strength, promising the start of a new day. A few weeks later, they stood together in the small, windswept cemetery in Copper Creek. They had reinterred Tommy's remains, bringing him from the lonely plot in Kansas to this quiet patch of prairie. Crawford had arranged everything, a silent act of solidarity and understanding. A new simple headstone read, Thomas Knoxley, beloved brother. Alberta held the silver locket in her hand. She had cleaned it, polished it, until it shone. For a long time she simply looked at it, the last tangible piece of her old life, the catalyst for so much pain, and ultimately for so much truth. Then, with a quiet finality, she placed it on the fresh earth at the base of the headstone. It was not a gesture of forgetting, but of acceptance, of finally letting go of the guilt that was never hers to bear. Crawford, standing beside her, took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, the prairie wind whispering through the tall grass around them. They were two people who had been hollowed out by loss, who had found in each other not a way to fill the emptiness, but a way to build something new in the space that remained. As they turned to leave, Alberta paused. Something had prompted her to pick up the locket one last time. She opened the clasp, wanting one final look at Tommy's smile. The familiar tintype was there, she and her brother frozen in a happy moment from a lifetime ago. But something else was there too. Tucked carefully behind the portrait was a tiny pressed wildflower, its delicate purple petals perfectly preserved. It was a prairie crocus, one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring on the high windy hills of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Her breath caught. She remembered a few days ago seeing Tremont sitting quietly on the porch with the locket in his small hands. She had assumed he was just looking at the picture again. But he had been doing more. He had been adding his own story to it. A silent, childish gesture of love and acceptance, a single wildflower, bridging the past and the future, connecting a lost brother with a new family. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Crawford, a silent question on her face. He just smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners and squeezed her hand. They walked back toward the wagon, hand in hand. In the distance, they could see the beginnings of a new frame house rising from the ashes of the old one. And running toward them from the construction site, his face bright with a smile that was no longer rare, was Tremont. He ran into their arms, and they became what they had been forged into by fire and loss and love, a complete new family ready to build their future on the resilient ground of the Broken Arrow.